Hey, it's Rocky. Welcome to Richer Soul. Today's guest is Doc G, who shares his wisdom around life, death, health, and wealth. Imagine it's 12 months from now, and you've achieved your major life goals. How does it feel to be in the best shape of your life? To wake up energized, excited about the day? To have great relationships and friends who support you and propel you forward? How does it feel to have an excess of money, to be able to make the choices you want? To be fearless and open to trying new adventures? Imagine being connected to the universe and it providing everything you desire. It's possible over time, and your past does not dictate your future. The only thing holding you back from this vision is you. It's time to take control of our thoughts and use them to our advantage. Welcome to Richer Soul, where we achieve our dreams and bring balance to health, wealth, relationships, time, and spirituality. If you have not had a chance to listen to episodes 1 through 9, I encourage you to go back and listen to the framework behind Richer Soul and how to create the life of your dreams. You can also find all the show notes for this episode at richersoul.com. While you're there, you can sign up for a monthly email where I share the best articles I read this month, let you know about upcoming episodes, and share a little wisdom. You can also listen to coaching calls under the Coaching Calls tab. I also share the most interesting articles I read every week on Facebook at facebook.com/Richer Soul. And there's also a Facebook group where you can ask questions and interact with other listeners. Today's quote is from Steve Jobs. Your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. We're going to cover many of the topics from that quote in today's discussion, from life to death and choosing your path regardless of life's circumstances. Our focus today is on spirituality. To me, that means understanding our core beliefs. At our very essence, what is it that we believe and how is it that we're going to lead our life? Where did the rules come that define you? Do you embrace the dogma of what you believe? We need to be in harmony with ourselves and ensure that what we believe is true. Do you know the why behind your core values? Do you know what your heart wants? And do you have the courage to follow it? I know I've made career choices that limit me from success in work, but they allow me to have success in life because that was more important to me, and I knew it. Many times in life, our identity gets tied to our titles at work. You really should be more than just your work. We'll chat about that today as well. Our time on Earth is both long and short. Make the most of it. I'm excited to chat with Doc G about life, death, health, wealth, and his wisdom. Doc G is an internal medicine physician who recently entered half retirement and spends his time as a hospice medical director. Writer of the personal finance blog DiversifyFI.com and podcast host of the What's Up Next podcast, which is a really cool new podcast that features real conversations. Let's meet our guest. Welcome to Richer Soul, Doc G. It's great to have you join us today.
I'm excited to be on.
So, we always start at the beginning. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
So I can look back at my childhood and think of really two distinct periods. The first one was when I was very, very young. My father was a physician and my mom was a housewife, and we really didn't think or talk about money much, and I was pretty young, so I didn't understand it. Now, when I was 8 years old, my father died unexpectedly, and it just so happened that my mom was going to business school just out of interest. And so she was a semester away from graduating business school. She was lucky enough to be offered a job at her internship. And so even though I didn't know it then, as an adult, I learned that she was very worried about money at that time and that I already had made plans of selling our house and moving into an apartment one day so that she could pay for our college. But I was pretty much protected from that. I didn't know, and I certainly don't feel like I wanted for anything at that time. Now, eventually my mom remarried and she opened up her own business, and she married a businessman who had a business that he was involved with in the healthcare field. And they were kind of what we look at in the financial independence community as like the perfect model. They were definitely stealth wealth practitioners. They didn't talk about money. They didn't spend much money. I think they probably saved more than 50% of their income most of their lives. They owned real estate and properties, and they owned their own businesses. So I don't think my parents ever sat me down and talked to me about money and how you manage it, but they were really good at modeling good financial behavior. And so that's what I really took from it. And especially I can think back to my high school years, seeing them maneuver the real estate properties, hearing them talk at the dinner table about their jobs and promotions and different opportunities that were coming their way. So I kind of soaked it all in.
And so that's a big thing. I think for kids, they learn from watching what you do, and having that dinner time conversation is also very important. They're seeing how the parents interact, the struggles that their parents are facing, and also the success that their parents have and how they go through situations. And I think that kind of modeling really tends to cross over to the kids. You're not talking directly to them, but they're absorbing from that. So are you doing anything differently, or how are you teaching your kids about money?
So with my kids, we take a little bit of a different tact. We do try to provide all that same modeling, which means I take them to real estate closings. I include them when I'm trying to find new tenants for each of my condos. We talk about our jobs. We talk about the businesses we run. But we also have set up an allowance system that's just a little bit different. So we pay our children $10 a week for the whole year. But what we do is we give it all to them at one time. So on January 1st, we give them $520. And then they are responsible for budgeting the whole year. We do buy things like, obviously, food and necessities and school supplies, but they actually are responsible for their own clothes, as well as electronics, toys, that kind of thing. So we've tried to build in a method for them to learn how to budget. And that way they can kind of see what happens with their money. If they spend too much in the beginning, they'll find that later on the year, they don't have anything left over. And we, of course, try to get them to also save a certain amount every year, too. So that has given them, I think, a little bit of practice. And as opposed to sitting them down and just doing didactic teaching, we find moments where they're having trouble with this system, where they're trying to decide whether to buy something or not, and then use that as a teaching experience.
And that's very similar to what we've done. We used a slightly different method, but the same concepts. And I think in order for kids to learn about money, you have to put money into their hands. Now, I would imagine a year is a very long time to have to figure out how to hold on to that money and appropriately spend it. Did they used to run out a lot as the year got towards the end?
So my kids are very different. My son, who's 14, tends to spend much more money, but he also finds ways to make money. So he will go volunteer himself to the neighbors and do odd chores around and help them out. He's also very electronically proficient. So he started his own little business of fixing iPhones and phones that have cracked screens. So he, for $30, can order the screen and then do the work to replace it if someone cracks their screen. So what I found is that he will work through money faster, but then will find extra ways of making money, whereas my daughter is a little bit of the opposite. She will plan very carefully, and you can see she'll see something at the store she wants to buy, and you'll kind of see her working through, well, how much do I really want this? Do I have enough money for it? If I buy this now, is there something I won't be able to buy in the future? So it's interesting watching the two different personality types go at it. I would love to say that we don't hassle them when they spend and just let them figure it out on their own. But we still are parents. And so occasionally we kind of look at my son and say, do you really want to spend money on that? But I'm trying as time goes by to let them both make mistakes, because I think if they don't make the mistakes, they won't truly learn from the experience.
And that's very true. You have to learn through mistakes. And also it's that mistakes are just learning experiences. And we can overcome them and we can get back up. And it sounds like even though they're different, they're learning their personalities, they're working within their personalities, and then they're using their personalities to appropriately manage the money in a way that fits them, which is cool. Your son kind of figures out, hey, I can have more by working more. And your daughter sounds like the more cautious type. And it's true. Every kid is different and you have to treat them differently. And you have to let them create a system that works for them instead of imposing something on them.
Yeah, and I think we make the mistake as parents of we try to stop them from making mistakes when the mistakes are really low stakes. It's like at this age, 11 and 14, if they mess up with their money and end up with nothing and have to suffer a little bit, or even if I have to bail them out, it's no big deal. So why give them such a huge safety net now when it's safe to fail? I've really been thinking a lot about that because when they get older, when they're young adults, when they're making their own money, failure could be a lot more painful and difficult at that age. So much better to deal with it now, to see them through these mistakes and have them learn from them.
And that's very true. And as you said, failure now is not really a big deal. They have a roof over their head. They have food in their stomach. Okay, they might not have the latest clothes because they ran out of money, but again, your son will figure out how to make more. And I think your daughter's a little younger, so maybe as she grows, she will also figure out, hey, I can go babysit and I can recover from that financial setback.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I guess at some point you'll have to learn and teach them and hand them credit cards. I think around the time 15, 16 is when we gave our kids credit cards so that they started to understand what it really meant and how they worked, and also so that they wouldn't go out and do something crazy later in life and swipe without thinking.
Yeah, we found out at 14 years old, actually, my son now does qualify for a debit card. So he just got a debit card, which he's very excited about just because it makes life a lot easier. He doesn't always have to run to the bank if he wants cash. But it's hard to do that before 14, although there are some online cards that you can buy where you put money in and then give them to your younger child and allow them to do something very similar.
Or you can just buy a Visa gift card that you can replenish if you want to do something like that as well. And that also limits if it gets lost or if they do something crazy, they can only go up to the $100 or $200 that's on that card.
Yeah, there are definitely a few methods out there if you want to do it for your younger children.
So one of the questions that come up, especially amongst those who have built wealth, is how do you pass it to your kids? Do you build generational wealth? Or do you kind of force them to do it on their own? Because if you give them money, they don't actually truly learn how to build wealth. And so it's kind of a struggle of how do you do that? Are you going to build generational wealth or do you have some other goals?
So I have a generational answer for that. And the reason why is I guess you could call me third generation financially independent. So my step-grandfather was a dentist, and he retired at the age of 49 and then lived for the next 50 whatever years, money that he made up to the age of 49. He practiced geo-arbitrage. He moved to Santa Fe, which was incredibly low cost at the time. He was very, very frugal. And then my parents, too, are financially independent. They're stealth wealth practitioners. They built businesses. And then there's me. And what they did is they generally supported their children. They generally paid for college. But that was usually the end of it. The idea is to give your kids the right modeling, the right teaching, and then give them a strong financial starting. Make sure that they're not coming into their adult life in huge amounts of debt. But then it's pretty much up to each of the children. And so that's what I plan with my own children. I plan on teaching them important financial lessons at this age. I plan on teaching them how to work. I plan on paying for their college. They probably will have to get some type of job even during college. And then I think it's up to them to learn how to fly on their own. If they go to graduate school, of course, I may help them longer. But I think you have to learn to make it on your own, at least in the beginning. Will I eventually leave an inheritance? I'm sure I'll leave them something. A lot of the ways it works in my family actually is the inheritance doesn't go to the children, it goes to the grandchildren. So I got small inheritances from my grandparents, and that's probably what I'll do for my grandchildren too. But I'll also probably donate a lot of it too. You can give the next generation money, and that'll only last them so long. But if you give them knowledge and teaching and good financial modeling and stewardship, that can last for generations. Your money will run out, your teaching won't.
And that's very true. I guess what I was thinking of is in the sense that by the time I leave my kids money, they won't need it. And that's kind of my goal. But by having that, it creates, in a sense, a larger pot to give the next generation a bit more freedom to be able to make the choices they want to make. And I guess that's a difference in perspective because you've already come through multiple generations of having that strong financial base. Whereas we're immigrants. So we kind of we had to build our base. And I haven't had multiple generations with that strong base in the United States. So it's something we still think through. But for us, I think we'll leave our kids money, but we'll leave our kids money at the point where it just doesn't matter anymore. It's like, oh, that was nice, but we don't need it.
Yeah, I almost like to think of it as a generational insurance policy. So what happens is when you build wealth over generations like this, if you do have a tragedy, if you do have a long-term disability, if you do have a depression, you're going to be better off as a family, and you protect each other and you help each other. So I always have liked this idea of having the money in the family such that if tragedy were to occur, everyone was covered.
Very much. And I've also read and I've watched, and I know I don't want to create a family trust, and I don't want to create something where the money becomes a source of contention, where generations start fighting over it or expect it. And that's one of the big downfalls of leaving generational wealth. So I'm being mindful to not create that type of an atmosphere. And our kids know that, parents' money is parents' money. We have to kind of go out and do. We've never said to them, you'll be blessed with this when we die. It's just never been a topic of conversation.
Yeah, as Doug Nordman said on one of our podcasts, he said he wanted to make sure his daughter knew that he was rich. Him and his wife are rich or financially independent, but his daughter's poor. And in some ways, that's how you have to let your kids know. I mean, in a sense, you've built your wealth. That wealth will benefit them. You will support them. You will be good parents, but they've also got to do it on their own.
Very true. And that's kind of the way we talk to our kids. And Doug's been a guest on the show. It's one of the early episodes. I can't remember exactly what number, but Doug and I went through and we talked literally for a whole hour about how to raise financially savvy kids. So if you're interested, it's back in the archives. Go back and listen to it.
Yeah, I'll definitely listen to that one.
So you are a physician and you spend most of your time, I believe, in hospice service, which is basically dealing with end-of-life issues. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, I am now 100% hospice. So throughout my career, I've done general medicine, I've done hospital work, I've done nursing home work, and as of recently, I've now centered my work practice on just hospice.
So what have you learned from your hospice experiences about how people face the end of their life? It's, we're all going to face this one day, and none of us wants to really talk about it. Yet it's the reality. And I know we've gone through it a couple times, and this past year in a couple episodes as well. I'd just love to hear what you see from a much more global perspective.
So I think I've learned a few main things about both living and dying by doing hospice work. The first one is that I've seen many, many, many people die. And actually, the process of dying is not scary. It generally is not painful. And given the right help, good hospice care, good end-of-life care, mostly people themselves don't suffer during death, at least not physically. And so that was actually very reassuring. And it's one thing that I feel as a physician, having the experiences I have, it allows me to get over, I think, that fear that a lot of people have just about end of life in general. The next thing I kind of realize is that people tend to die the way they live. So if you are a happy, content person, those people tend to have happy and content deaths. Or if you're an anxious, angry person, those people tend to have anxious and angry deaths. So it's really kind of about who you are. So if the idea of dying really scares you, it may make sense to try to build a good life, and most likely your death will follow in the same path. And then the last thing I kind of realized is that all those things we kind of worry about from day to day are probably not the things that we'll regret when we die or when we're close to dying. We tend to regret things like relationships. We tend to regret concentrating on the wrong things, right? So all these people who are out there and working themselves to the bone 24/7, 7 days a week, those are the kind of things people tend to regret. It usually isn't things. It usually isn't money. I mean, sometimes people regret that they didn't manage their money better, but it usually isn't that they didn't have more. So when you get to the end of life, it kind of distills what's important to you. And mostly what's important are things like the connection you had to your family and friends, the purpose you felt your life fulfilled, and those things that you accomplished that validated that purpose, your identity, how you looked at yourself and said, this is who I am and this is what I stand for. Those are kind of the things that matter when you get to end of life.
And that's very true. And as you said, how you do one thing is how you do all things. So how you live your life is, I guess, how you will die. And if you live a great life, then, I guess the only regret is that you don't get to spend more time living it. But that's always the case. We only get so much time, and we need to make the best of it and to use it wisely.
I like to think about life in the sense of the things we can change and the things we can't. So we can change who we are. We can change how we treat other people. We can change to a great extent what we accomplish. But sometimes it's hard to change when we're going to die because there are things out of our control.
And there's a lot out of our control. I mean, in some senses, you can die in an accident. And we've had a lot of guests on who've had near-death experiences that have kind of caused them to reevaluate life and change the way that they went forward. And then, of course, sometimes you get a disease and there is no cure. And so you have to go through that whole process. And it's funny, one of the things that's happened, at least within our family, and that we afterwards you kind of appreciate, is when you kind of know the end is coming, because then you have a chance to kind of say goodbye and to clean up things. It's much nicer than kind of when it's sudden, because you get nice closure from something like that.
Yeah, I think people don't realize that there's such thing as death with dignity. And so one of the wonderful things about hospice care, if you get a disease that gives you a little bit of time to tie off loose ends, we can help you have dignity. And one of the ways you have dignity is not being in pain. But also a very important way of having dignity is having the time to say goodbye to those people you love, having the time to finish whatever affairs are left in your life that you don't want to leave unresolved. So my father died when I was 8. He had a brain hemorrhage. It happened suddenly. I look back at my life and I had a sad event happen to me, but it didn't make a sad life. But I do feel that bit of sadness for him that he left so suddenly.
So he didn't get a chance, I guess, to say goodbye is what you mean by that, correct? It was more of a very short type of thing?
Yes, he had a headache and died within an hour.
Okay. So, and that happens sometimes, unfortunately. And my mom died when I was 7. I guess she had a year in a sense from diagnosis to when she passed away. And I mean, I'm assuming at the first part of that, death wasn't probably an expected outcome, but I know towards the latter part it was. And so they were able to kind of go through those types of things. And again, these things happen to us, but yet they give us certain life experiences that in a sense make us who we are today. And without those experiences, we would probably be very different people. And so while it's not a great event to have to go through, it also creates greatness kind of going forward.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way of putting it. And certainly my work in hospice, I'm sure on some level comes from having a parent die at such a young age. One of the first things I did in medical school was volunteer for hospice. And this was like within the first week of medical school. In some ways, the fact that I even became a doctor in the first place, probably part of it was that my father died when I was 8 years old and he was a doctor. And it was at a time where I really looked up to him. Being 8, when you're 8, you haven't got to that teenage years where you start looking at your parents and questioning them as much. So I idolized him. And so you can look kind of back at those things that happened in your life, as you were talking about, and you can see sadness and pain, or you can see that they made you into what you are today, and that has value.
And that it does. So, one of the other things that we haven't talked about as much, and I'd really like to delve into you, is kind of the state of healthcare today. I don't think people realize how much change is going on and how much the healthcare system has dramatically changed. And it's actually happened rather quickly, probably in the last 10 years. I know in our area, we have seen literally private practices kind of go out of existence, and everything is what I today call corporate medicine, because they got bought up by one institution, and then that institution got bought up by another institution that's nowhere even near here. And all of these big systems are kind of being created, and it's dramatically changing the way healthcare is delivered. And I'm sure it's dramatically changing the way that doctors have to practice medicine.
Yeah, I think there's a huge amount of change going on. And I think the sad part is always when policy really starts driving practice. There are some good things that can come of that. When policy starts to dictate better, higher quality practice, that's great. Unfortunately, currently in our healthcare system, policy is driving a lot of compliance, which means the job of doctors and nurses and therapists and caregivers in general today is filled with hours and hours of work that probably doesn't overall add to the care of the patient. And when you get to this place, it starts affecting the quality of practice, because doctors, as opposed to sitting and listening closely to their patient across the exam table from them, are now having their heads buried in a computer, and that's taking away some of their concentration. I always like to say, if you went to an orchestra and the composer was expected to not only stand up on stage and compose the orchestra, but also to be at the front desk collecting tickets as people walked in, it just wouldn't make much sense. And so when we go to medical school, we spend thousands and thousands of hours practicing in an attempt to build mastery. And I like to think of mastery as a dance, and it's a very intricate dance. And the problem with healthcare policy right now is it's diverting that dance, it's changing it, and it's messing with mastery. That's the bad news. The good news is that these systems are in flux. And when you get a system that starts to fail or have problems, eventually there's pushback. And we're starting to see that pushback. Part of that pushback is doctors are leaving medicine. People are retiring early. Younger physicians are moving out of clinical medicine. One thing we're starting to see, which we never saw before, is that medical students and residents, people who are still in training, are going through training with the idea of never practicing in the first place. You have some medical school classes where 15 to 20% of the graduates are never going to practice medicine. They're going into business or healthcare administration. These are all signs, at least to me, that the system is starting to hit a breaking point. It feels very negative at the moment, but I don't think it has to be. One of the wonderful things we have is we have all these doctors out there and nurses and therapists and social workers who have these real stories about themselves, about healthcare, about patients. And the internet allows us to get out there and start telling these stories. And I think when we tell stories about healthcare and about struggle and about caring for people, we can start reforming those bonds between doctor and patient. And I think if we do that, if we can come together and listen to each other's stories, we can become allies. And I think if we become allies, we can then challenge some of the policy changes that are occurring and try to reset them in such a way that is better. It's better for patients, it's better for doctors, it's better for society.
Absolutely. And I've been watching the change, and I have noticed that that relationship between the physician and the patient has, in many instances, disappeared, where depending on what type of practice you go into, you may not see the same doctor every time you go in. And I know in the hospital, especially if you're in the hospital long term, depending on how your hospital's run and how your primary care is run, literally every day or every second or third day, there is a new doctor in charge of your health care. And almost every day and almost every shift, there's a new nurse in charge of your healthcare. And with everyone kind of being pushed and crunched, communication from one to the next just does not seem to occur as well as it should. And it's almost like, seems like every time we were having conversations, it was restating everything and starting over from the beginning. And thankfully, I mean, I understand health and I understand medicine, so I know the right questions to ask. And I feel bad for people who are in these situations who don't even know the right questions to ask or won't even stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, what's going on here and how can we work together to make this better?
Yeah, I would say the exact same thing. I had to go to medical school and become a practicing physician to learn how to properly advocate for my own family members when they're in the hospital. So I think you're completely right on that. And I think there is a huge amount of fragmentation. And the fragmentation really is a response to current policy. What you see is that policy is implemented and years later there are downstream effects that people either didn't realize or didn't care about. Again, that's the negative side. The positive side is we can recognize these changes and maybe we can start fighting for better policy.
And hopefully we can. It's going to be a long, drawn-out battle. And the cost of healthcare is skyrocketed. I mean, that's one of the big things I think that keeps people working longer is having to deal with a $30,000 a year health insurance policy. For many people, that's just an astronomical amount of money to pay. And unfortunately, there are some reasonable alternatives coming out now with the health sharing ministries, and they do have limits, but it's funny, you can't even buy a decent high deductible policy without spending a fortune. And it's a shame that it's kind of come down to this.
Yeah, in our community, we talk about retirement a lot. And I will tell you, the number one concern I always hear when people talk about retirement is how are they going to pay for healthcare? Unless you are at Medicare age, that is your biggest concern.
It is. It's my biggest concern as well, because I know that $30,000 a year for a lot of years is going to add up to a lot of money. And so it changes the way that you do things, or you have to play games to stay into the medical exchanges, but then you really have to drop your income. And I just don't want to live on that small amount of money. So it becomes a constant battle. One of the other things that we kind of touched on it, but I think patients and families need to take responsibility for their health care. I don't know. Do you see a lot of people kind of expecting someone else to be in the driver's seat besides them, or are people stepping up and being involved in their health care and asking questions and taking the steps necessary to take care of their health?
I think you see the continuum. Certainly, we know in the United States that there are lots of ways to not take care of yourself. And there are huge swaths of the population that smoke, that don't exercise, that eat poorly. But you can balance that against the other swath of the population that is trying their darndest to stay healthy and take care of themselves. The truth of the matter is, in my opinion, your general health is actually not that difficult. There are some basic things you can do to help yourself, and the rest is genetics and luck, right? So you can not smoke. You can wear your seatbelt in the car. You can get moderate exercise. You can cut down on stress. You can minimize alcohol. You can do all these kind of really basic things. You can get your basic necessary screenings. Some types of screening are better than others. But above and beyond that, it falls to luck and genetics. But people do struggle with those basics, with wearing their seatbelts and not smoking and not overeating and maintaining a healthy exercise regimen. So I think you see it all here. Certainly there is a segment of the population who is not at all taking responsibility for their health care.
We'll be back with our guest, Doc G, in a moment. We only have one life to live. We never know how much time we will get and when the end will come. That's why it's important to enjoy and live each moment to its fullest. Are you living all out? Are you running your business in a way that you don't have to be there every moment? When we have limited time, using that time wisely is important. Having a business coach who can help you create profit and increase your time freedom allows you to achieve those results even faster. Just as we have to have a doctor to look after our health, having someone to help look after our business is important. I help small business owners focus on their profits first so they can have freedom to live life. And we talk about life as well. Would you like to have someone on your side who can help you achieve success and helps you achieve your life goals even faster? Reach out for a no-obligation chat to see how I can help you achieve your goals even faster. It's Rocky@richersoul.com. Now let's talk with money with Doc G. And that's very true. So it's kind of funny because everyone thinks that they're rich and wealthy, but actually when you look at the top 10 professions based on money, doctors aren't even listed in them. And yet everyone looks at them as wealthy, and I think a lot of physicians think they have to live a doctor lifestyle money-wise. What's been your experience with that?
I think doctors are just like everyone else. There's one big difference, is we have a higher income. But above and beyond that, if you look at our population as a whole, you could guess that maybe 50 or 75%, maybe more, should be able to reach a stable financial position, should be able to reach financial independence even if they want to, right? They're basic steps. You have to earn a certain amount, you have to save a certain amount, you have to practice some frugality, you have to invest a little bit. That's not different no matter what station you're in, right? Whether you're making $500,000 a year, $200,000 a year, or $20,000 a year. The thing is, when you look at our population as a whole, none of us get it. You know, financial independence is something that all of us should be able to understand, and yet only a small percentage of the population ever gets there. So there's something about this headspace of learning how to be smart with money that all strata have trouble with. Now, physicians, it's true, there are a few things about us. One, as I said, is we do make a high income. The other problem, though, is that most of us have been in medical school, in residency. We've been making very little money and working very hard. So the phenomenon tends to be that once you actually go from a resident or fellow's salary, which is reasonable but not very high, to an attending salary when you finally finished your training and all of a sudden you're making hundreds of $1,000s a year, there's this huge impetus to spend. So I think one of the things that affects us differently from the rest of the population is that we have such a huge jump in salary over a small period of time. Certainly there is also this aspect that as physicians we have to carry ourselves a certain way in society. And therefore, some people feel like they do need the big house and the nice car. But I think it's a mix of these factors. I will tell you that I've seen both sides of it. Certainly, you hang out in the personal finance blogosphere, you see plenty of doctors who really do understand the economics of their situation. But, for instance, I worked with a guy who was making well over $400,000 a year, but still had to borrow money from some of our employees to pay his nanny every week. So you can see the whole spectrum. But what it really does say to me is it's not about the money or the capacity to make money that sets people apart. It's the mindset. And I think doctors, just like anyone else, a lot of us don't have the right mindset when it comes to money.
And I would probably agree with that. And I think for doctors especially, I think their society almost puts the wrong mindset on them of you have to live a certain lifestyle because you're a doctor. And doctors have very wide incomes. I mean, some of them make a lot less and some of them make a lot more, but yet everyone kind of looks at them the same and judges them that way. And it takes a little bit of the right mindset to say, I am not going to live a particular way. But even along those lines, because I've spoken to many doctors as they finish up residencies and fellowships and then go out and begin their practices. If you take just those first few years when you're beginning and you build a rock solid financial plan, 10 or 15 years later, you can live just like the doctor who's kind of living the big lifestyle. But because you built your base properly, you have the ability to live like that. And unfortunately, if you do things in the wrong order and you don't build the base first, you can be in the same place, but in a lot worse financial situation.
Yeah, I use the term front loading the sacrifice. But if you listen to Jim Daly of the White Coat Investor, he'll say to live like a resident even after you're finished with your residency. The great thing about this profession is you do make a high salary. So if you can figure it out for those first few years, if you can build that base, your road to financial security and even financial independence can be very fast. And so that's the good news. Once you actually do all that hard work and you're a practicing physician, you command a large salary. And if you figure out what to do with that early on in the game, you're going to do really well.
And that's very true. And that's why I say the first couple steps, you do them right, everything else will work out. But you screw up those first couple steps and you're going to have a big hole to dig yourself out of, which is a shame. I know one of the things that you talk about, and this is not just true of physicians, but this is true of all high-income people. We start to make a lot of money, and then we start to think, well, we deserve certain things. And as you talked about nannies and going out to eat and all of these types of things, I think we have to figure out a balance between those types of things of what is reasonable, what is unreasonable. And what I talk about is an hourly rate. It's what's a reasonable hourly rate for me to say it's better for me to work and pay than for me to do the work. So, for example, I mean, we have someone who cleans our house because she's going to do it for a much lower hourly rate than what I could command doing something else. And so it makes sense to get help and to pay people to do certain things. It's not a luxury. It's a smart business decision. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do a lot of talking and writing about the nature of work in general. I think we misunderstand work. I think work is just providing goods and services. And I really think that we work our whole lives, whether we call it employment or not, it's a different story. You know, employment is when you're doing work for someone else. But if you just think of work as providing goods and services from the day we're born to the day we die, we're doing some type of work. You might be providing those goods and services for yourself, or you might be providing them for someone else. So where it gets interesting is people talk about retirement or they talk about wanting to work less. And so they make these trade-offs, right? So they say, well, I don't want to spend as many hours in the hospital seeing patients or in the office seeing patients. So I'm going to come home and I'm going to fire my housekeeper and my nanny, and I'm going to take care of my kids and I'm going to scrub my toilets. And that all sounds good, except when you realize that they hate scrubbing their toilets. And in fact, that hour they spend cleaning their bathroom is one of the worst hours of the week, that maybe they should just go and work a few more hours at being a doctor, at being in the hospital, or at being in the office, something that they find mildly annoying sometimes, but also enjoy. And maybe they work a little more and have a little more money and use that money so that they can pay for goods and services for someone else to come in and do the work for them. So I think it can be a slippery slope. I think we have to think about how we really want to spend our time, because time is really all about trade-offs, right? So you can spend your time doing that so-called work or your W-2 job, or you can spend that time at home doing other types of work. And the question is, which type of work makes you passionate? And so I could retire. I could stop working completely. I could do other things with my time, but I realized that working in hospice is something I'm passionate about. So if I'm going to be doing work of some kind all the time, I might as well be doing something that I enjoy. In this case, it happens to pay me too. So hey, that's great. But why spend your time doing things you don't want to do in the name of saving money? I can see doing that on some level. If you're in a job that doesn't provide enough economically for you, there are certainly situations where you do have to do things you don't enjoy doing to save money. But whenever you're lucky enough to have that choice, I don't think we should just outright discard the idea of doing some type of employment, because maybe doing that employment is a lot more enjoyable than some of the other things that we're stuck doing.
And that's very true. You have to be intentional with that. And I think actually this is a good time to talk about a particular thing, because I think a lot of people, especially people with degrees, so, you know, an attorney, a lawyer, an engineer, their I don't know if self-worth is the right thing, but their identity is tied up with that title. And when you no longer have that title, if you don't have something else to do, you in a sense have lost your identity if you are that tied to that particular identity.
Yeah, and we see this a lot in physicians. So there are many physicians out there who are starting to burn out at work. And they're looking at their finances, and those who have front-loaded the sacrifice and who have been very careful may look at their finances and say, hey, I don't need to be a doctor anymore. But as opposed to that causing joy, it certainly for me, when I got to that point, it did cause a little bit of an identity crisis because I had built my sense of purpose and identity around being a physician. And so I think you have to be really thoughtful when you're in those big type of careers, like you said, that where you've spent a lot of time and money on education. You have to think about how that part of yourself, that job that you do, plays into your sense of self and how important it is. So I know for me that being a physician is part of my identity. And so as opposed to saying, I'm tired of working, I'm tired of all the difficult things in medicine, I'm going to leave, I said, well, I'm going to take my strong financial position and use it to get rid of everything I don't like about being a physician. And so I could pull back on all those things that were tiresome. I could pull back on the late night phone calls. I could pull back on the stressful situations and find a niche within medicine, one that still helped reaffirm my identity, still gave me a good sense of purpose, but that didn't bring all the baggage that I wasn't liking about the job. And to me, that's the best argument for financial security, is the idea that once you reach this level of financial security, you can start getting rid of those things that don't affirm your identity and purpose and start building in a life that really fulfills your needs.
And I can't tell you how many times I've heard this from people who have just regular W-2 jobs in a variety of different areas. When your boss thinks that you need that job more than he needs you, he's the person with all the power. But when you have financial independence and you don't want to do things, you have the ability to say to your boss, I'm not doing that. And they may say goodbye, in which case you just get up and walk out and you have the ability to do that. But a lot of times, if you're actually good at what you do and you provide value, all of a sudden they start changing their tune and they start accommodating you. And all of a sudden, that shift in balance gives you the power to do whatever you want. And in order to do that, you need to have that financial stability that gives you the freedom to be able to say no to whatever you want to say no to in life.
Yeah, another way of putting that is the W-2 asset class is the poor man's asset class. It is a strong asset class. It's a very important asset class. And one of the reasons is you actually don't need anything to start with, right? You don't need an initial investment to take advantage of the W-2 asset class. Your investment is your time. However, once you get more financially stable and you have, let's say, real estate, or you have index funds, or you have even businesses that you own that spin off money, all of a sudden the W-2 asset class is not as necessary. The other asset classes require an initial investment, and that investment is the barrier to entry. But once you've overcome that barrier, it gives you a lot of strength in negotiating that W-2 asset class.
That it does. And the two other ways is to do a business, and you don't have to quit your job and start a business. There are plenty of people who build side hustles, and we've had some of them on the show where little by little, they tested out their side hustle. And when their side hustle started to make enough money that it overcame their W-2 job, they were able to walk away and do something different. And another one is real estate. Both of those paths are definitely viable paths that anybody can take. And both of those paths can start with very little money. You do not have to have a lot of money in either case to be able to begin. A lot of times it's more investing your time and your efforts in the beginning and putting in the hours that are needed to get things going.
Yeah, and I think the goal always is W-2 independence, right? We want to free ourselves from relying on someone else. And that's the whole idea behind why we invest and why we start these side hustles and why we do real estate. It's the idea that you can disconnect money from your purpose in life. And the best way to do that is to become financially independent.
It is. And that creates a whole new set of problems. And let's chat about them because, the tagline for this show is you got rich, now what? And I think a lot of people chase the money and that's their sole focus and they forget to live life and they get there and they get the money and now they can walk away or now they have the ability to do other things or they become less tolerant of life. And now the question comes, now what? What are you going to do now that you've gotten your financial rock in place? And I guess that comes down to, you call it contentment. Some people say happiness.
Yeah, I wrote a post called The Money Mind Meld. And what I talk about is that, especially in the financial independence community, we often use money as a mirage. It's almost like a false prophet. We use it as the goal. And sometimes it's more of a mile marker, right? So the idea is that if money is your goal, what happens once you get to that goal? You don't really have anywhere else to go. So a lot of what I try to think about, a lot of what I write about on my blog is trying to build in kind of purpose, identity, and connection into your life before you get to financial independence. That way, once you reach financial independence, you just have more power to pursue those things to a greater extent. And if I look at my own path, I would say that financial independence has allowed me to move away from some of the more lucrative areas in medicine because they were no longer bringing me joy and settle on hospice, which is less lucrative, but does reaffirm my purpose and identity much more than some of those other things do. So I think if money is your goal, you're going to find yourself relatively unhappy when you reach the end of your journey.
And that's true. And the reality is the end of our journey is kind of where we started this, which is death. And for a lot of people, there's a long time from end of work to when that happens. And I have heard that if you don't have anything to do when you retire, it isn't usually a lot of time. It happens rather quickly because, and I don't know if there's the reasons behind it, but you hear that so often is that people who retire and don't have anything to do don't seem to live very long. Yet those who retire and are excited and retire is probably not even the right word because they're leaving one type of work and going and doing another type of work that fulfills them. They tend to live forever. And I've seen so many people in their 70s and I'm like, wow, look at how much energy they have. Look at how much they're out doing. They don't act or look anything like it. And it's because they're loving what they're doing every day.
Yeah, I think there's always the risk when you leave your job, you leave a sense of automatic purpose, right? Every time we get up and we go to work in the morning, we have purpose. It might not be the ideal purpose. It might not be the purpose that drives our soul, but it is a sense of purpose that you wake up and have every day. And then you also have connection, right? So you're going to the office and you're interacting with a set of people. It may change from time to time, but there's a group of people that are responsible to you and you're responsible too. And that creates reason, right? So when you drop those things all of a sudden, if you haven't built up systems to take their place, I could imagine it is very unhappy. I think you need those things in your life. And so it doesn't surprise me that retirement can be very hard on people, especially if retirement is forced, either by age or unemployment, et cetera, as opposed to people seeing that as a time of greater purpose and connection. They actually lose those connections they have.
And that's very true. And I think that's why if you're younger and you're kind of going through life, your goal in life should not be retirement. You should have a bigger purpose beyond that because that's just, it's too small of a goal just to retire from work, especially if you don't know what you're going to do next. And there's a lot of people who are probably in that boat.
Yeah, I agree with you 100% on that. I think retirement in itself, and again, I think it's kind of an artificial term because again, we don't really retire. We just move on to something different. we may be moving on to something different that we don't necessarily need to make money for. But usually we're moving on to some other type of work. Again, that work could be many things, whether it's cleaning the house or enjoying a hobby or building or making or creating, whatever that is that we're doing. I think retirement is a term that we're having trouble with in our community, especially because a lot of people who do kind of quote unquote retire their W-2 job, if they are searching for purpose and identity and connection and going out there and learning and doing new things, they tend to find ways to make money anyway, whether that's writing a blog or that's building code that you're interested in or creating in some other manner. Usually people find themselves making money when they didn't expect to.
And that's very true. And I think it's because you have the time to think and be intentional, and it's something you enjoy doing. And when you're doing what you love, the quality of your work goes through the roof, and what you provide the world becomes much more valuable. And so that is very, very true.
Here's a big question, though. Why can't we do this when we're 20? It's funny. A lot of us, if we're lucky and we discover things like financial independence, we do it when we're 35 or 40 or 45 or 50. But the big question is, why is it not possible in our 20s? Some people do it, and maybe it's just that we don't yet know what lights us up. But wouldn't it be really powerful if we could find those things and do our best work when we were 21 or 22 or 23? Can you imagine what a career would look like then? I have a feeling people wouldn't be thinking about quote unquote retirement because they would just be out there creating and doing and enjoying themselves.
And so you're correct. And I know why it's happened in the past, and I'm making sure that it's not going to happen for my kids. So we're setting our kids up to start off life understanding that up front. Figure out what makes you happy and what drives you and go in that direction. I think what's happened in the past, and it has changed now, but if you think about it, if you grow up in America, what are you supposed to do? Go to high school. Now you need to go to college. What are you going to go to college for? Pick a degree. You've got kids who are 16, 17 years old picking a degree in whatever they pick, who maybe they've decided to be a lawyer because they watched a TV show with a lawyer, and that's not what being a lawyer is. They never once talked to a lawyer. And I say I'll pick on lawyers because half of lawyers who graduate law school don't even practice law. They went down a path or a track because a teacher, a parent, somebody put them on a track, and they just put their head down and kept driving on the track. They never stopped to say, is this my track? Is this what I want? Is this what I'm looking forward to? We were just sold this American dream. And I think today more and more people are saying, that's not my track. That's not the way I'm going to do things. And they're starting to question it. And I think the more and more kids question it, the better their chances are. For my kids, I'm more interested in them building stackable, usable skills that can take them anywhere they choose. So if they want to pivot in life, they're going to have the ability to pivot, because what I'm being told is half the jobs that are going to be created in 10 years don't exist today, meaning they don't even know what they're called. And half the companies in the S&P won't be there in 10 or 20 years. So there's going to be tremendous change going forward. And if you aren't building stackable, usable skills that apply anywhere, and you don't take the time to be intentional and think through it, then you get stuck on that track and you do one thing until one day you wake up and your industry no longer exists, or somebody knocks you off that track. I don't know. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this lately. I wrote a blog post called Mindset Best Skill Set. And so maybe the way I think about it now is this. I think it's fine when you're young to almost even be pushed in a direction that no one's sure about, right? I was pushed into being a doctor, not because someone specifically said you had to, but my unique history, my dad dying when I was 8, wanting to be just like him, kind of pushed me in that direction. I think the same can go for lawyers and accountants, engineers. Someone at some point says, this is what you should do. And a lot of times young people jump on it. The great thing is, what I've now learned and maybe took me in my 40s to realize is you can, as you were saying, pivot. So you can go to medical school, decide that practicing medicine isn't for you, and use those schools from medical school to become a businessman. Or you can learn those skills from law school to enter a different type of trade or to do something differently. So the point being is that you are building those skill sets, especially if you go to a professional school. What we've done poorly, I think, in the past is learned how to pivot early and pivot correctly. And so I think that might be what you're talking about too, how things are changing so rapidly in society. The gig economy is changing things so much. You may enter a field that might not ultimately be where you end, but if you can stack those skills as you're talking about within that field, you can then use them to pivot to something else. And so that's what I think is really important. And why I say mindset versus skill set is you're going to be getting skills throughout your life, but you need that mindset to pivot towards something that brings you more purpose.
And that's very true. So as I look at you, I see certain skill sets. You have a skill set of being able to write. And that writing skill set now allows you to write a blog. And it allows you to write a blog about what you enjoy. And so building that skill set of being able to write. And then I think, going forward, it's like, well, can you speak? Can you convince people? Can you share your story? Speaking is another great skill set. We don't do and I know because my daughter, as she was finishing high school, her biggest problem was they want me to write things that I will never write in my life. They want academic writing. Well, once you're done with school, no one ever writes another academic paper unless they stay in academia. It's essentially, you've been taught a useless skill. Why not learn how to write that people want to read what you wrote? Why not learn to write to be persuasive? Why not learn to write to share your passion, whatever your passion is at 16? Get up and write about something you love. And all of a sudden, kids will love English class instead of hate English class. And unfortunately, you build those skills that, and the relationship skills. Build the skills to learn how to make relationships, how to connect with people, how to help people. All of those types of things are the skill sets that no matter where you go will allow you to be successful.
Yeah, what I like to say is that I'm probably best in the world, or my best skill is being a doctor. But my passion and my purpose is more about communication, writing, giving talks, those kind of things. I wouldn't be able to do the writing and giving talks and storytelling nearly as well as I can unless I had gone to medical school and lived all this life and learned how to communicate with people and learned how to stand up in front of a class and talk about a disease process. All these skill sets I learned during medical school actually help reinforce what I really think is more my purpose that I've spent more time pivoting towards as I've gotten older. The other thing that being a physician did for me is it made me financially independent so that I could make this pivot and then not worry if I was particularly successful at it or not. And so that was one of the major benefits for doing the major degree, for going to medical school, for building a medical practice, all those things that I thought were my purpose at the time. And as I've gotten older, I've realized that they're a part of my purpose, but that communication was more the direction I wanted to go in. So I can say two things. One is that doing the professional degree actually built a lot of the skill set that I now used to become a better communicator, to tell my stories and to write my blogs. But it also gave me a good, strong financial footing to allow me to pursue this purpose without fear of it actually leading to monetization. And so that's been great.
And that's very true. It's learning those, I'll call them soft skills, because they are the soft skills that are actually what are much more important. And yet they really aren't talked and they aren't taught in school. It's very rare. You might get one class on all of that, just like you barely get a class on money. The things that make you successful in life, we seem to have left out of the schooling, which is a shame. And that's why I'm very intentional with my kids to make sure that they understand the life skills versus the particular degree skills or particular what's in a book of knowledge, because The reality is a lot of the knowledge in the book will never be utilized. It's more for passing a test and passing a hurdle than it is for being successful in life.
I definitely agree with you on that. I think life skills can take you very, very far. I think book skills can only take you so far, so to speak. So there's definitely a difference.
And yet, who do they want? They want the kid who can get the perfect SAT score and the 4.0, and that's how they judge you, instead of your ability to bring people together to do things. And that was really eye-opening for us as we went through the college process. It's like they're picking people wrong. And maybe that's why people get stuck, because they're told, hey, if you want to be successful and get into this great college that will propel you, you have to do XYZ, even though XYZ is probably not going to be what makes you super successful later in life.
Yeah, especially in today's society where we have the internet. So having communication and leadership skills is so amplified by the internet and social media. And 20 years ago, that just wasn't an option. And so now you can use your voice and use social media to amplify that voice. And although there's a lot of noise out there, if you have a compelling voice, if you have leadership skills, if you have something to say, you reach people. And I think that's a wonderful thing about living in today's society, that we have these opportunities to be heard.
And we do. And it's up to you to say, hey, this is what I want, and this is how I want to live my life, and I'm going to tell my story, and not worry that a lot of people may not like it. But that's okay, because the world is a very big place, and you can find your particular small tribe and go find them and connect with them. And they're out there. You just have to be intentional of what is it that you want and how do you want to do it. And then just go build the skills to make it all happen.
Yeah, 100%.
So is there anything that we should have talked about today that we haven't touched on yet that we should?
No, I think we covered a lot of the important stuff. I think it's just important again to say money is only as important as it gets you the freedom to do those things that give you purpose. And so I think in this community, we're lucky to have all of this advice on how to create and build wealth. But ultimately, I think it starts at the beginning of trying to figure out what you were meant to do and then pursuing it, and then the money will come.
And that's very true. And that's what we talk about here. At the core is your purpose. What is it you want in life? And take the time to figure that out. And I think a lot of people are afraid. They think, oh, if this is going to be my purpose, it's etched in stone and I can't change it. And that's not true at all. You'll find that as you go through every decade of life, your purpose may change. Your goals may change, and that's okay. But just be intentional of where you're going for the next decade. It's not something that you have to do for the rest of your life. You can pivot constantly as you find that it no longer serves you. Find the next thing that does serve you, or take the next step higher. But be intentional and think through it. And money is nothing but the fuel that allows you to be able to do that.
Yeah, I would say that it's not only okay to pivot, it's not only okay for your purpose to change, it's actually part of the joy of growing older and learning and doing new things and having new passions. And one thing that, to wrap up this conversation and bring it full circle, one thing I've learned that even patients in hospice, most people wake up every day with a plan for the day. And that plan involves doing something or seeing someone or going somewhere. And you're going to have these little plans your whole life. And that's okay. You don't get to one destination. You just get to one ending and then start a new beginning, even on your deathbed, even when you're in hospice. So you pivot, you learn, your purpose changes, and that's part of the joy of life.
And life happens in the journey. It doesn't happen at the end, because the end is essentially death, as you said. So you're on a journey. Enjoy the journey, wherever it takes you.
Well said.
So based on our conversation today, what's one action step people can take this week to move forward?
So I think a big action step is to open yourself up to the world and say yes to something. Maybe someone offers you plans on a Friday night. Maybe someone at work asks you to get involved in a project that you're not involved with. Whatever it may be, I think a big part of finding what that purpose is being open to trying new things. So to me, a really important big first step is to let the world come to you, open yourself up, and be available for opportunities and not be afraid to try new things so that you can get more in touch with what really makes you content.
And along those lines, I think the more fearful the opportunity is to you, the more you should lean into it, especially if there's no risk. And I think too often, as long as there's no risk that your whole life is going to fall apart because you did this, go take a little risk and lean into the fear and try something new. I know tomorrow I have to referee. I've never refereed in my life. We'll see how it goes. They asked me to do it, and I just said, sure, why not? You need help? I'll do it. I'm better than nobody, right? Because they needed it. So I think that's a great action step for this week.
Yeah, the worst thing that happens is you fall down, you just have to pick yourself back up.
Well, the kids will just tell me what I'm supposed to have done, and then I'll just go to the other ref. And they said I should do this. Is that correct? And yeah, sorry, kids. I'm just learning. It's okay. So if people want to connect with you, where can they find you, and where's the best place for them to look at your work?
The best way to reach me is at my blog. It's diversefy.com. That's diversefy.com. I also co-host a podcast with Paul Thompson called the What's Up Next podcast. You can find that on iTunes and Stitchers, as well as at diversefy.com. There's a podcast link. And I'm on Facebook under the name Doc Green, as well as on Twitter at DocGDiversify.
And we'll put a lot of those links in the show notes to make it easy for anyone who wants to click and to find you. Thank you so much for being here this week. It was a joy to have this conversation.
Yeah, it was a pleasure chatting with you.
The principles of Richer Soul are clear. We need purpose, great relationships, health, control of our time, wealth, connections to the universe. Everyone lives this in their own unique way. Today, we heard another journey. What about you? Do you have the intentionality and clarity of what you want? We never know when we will face the end. As for me, I will not face it with regrets. Do you need to pivot? You have more options open to you now than you can imagine. You just need to decide what it is that makes you happy and fits your goals. You may take different paths over time, and they will fork, and you will find new ways forward. Sometimes they're dead ends, and we'll need to turn around and try another one. That's life. What skills do you need to improve to help you along your journey? I'm working on writing and public speaking this year. No matter what path I end up on, those are skills that will help me. This week's action step: open yourself up to the world and say yes. It doesn't have to be big and scary. Try something new. Opportunity is always knocking. We just need to listen and open the door. If you're still listening, you must have liked this episode. So please share it with a few friends. I would really appreciate that. What's preventing you from moving forward, and who are you putting on your team to help build the life you deserve? Taking no action creates a far worse outcome in life than trying something and failing. Just remember, one dream session with me can help propel you on your path with a clear map for the next steps. You can always get me at rocky@richersoul.com. I'd love to hear how you're doing and how the information I've shared has helped you. Thanks for listening. Have an abundant week.